All right, ladies and gents, welcome back. So, we're going to pick up our topic on evolution by natural selection today, really starting to get into this idea of microevolution, which really is genetic evolution. So, when we look at this idea of evolution, we look at these ideas of genetics. Remember, Darwin really didn't understand that DNA existed, he didn't know the principles of genetics. And yet, as science has sort of progressed and looked at these two fields, we've really come to understand that evolution and genetics very much are tied to each other. Because in order for a trait to get passed on and actually matter in terms of evolution, that trait has to be inheritable, meaning it's got to be coded for in your DNA. And DNA and those frequencies and how they get passed on from one generation to the next really is what genetics is all about. So when we look at evolution from a genetic standpoint, we're looking at these changes in the frequency of a gene in a given population from one generation to the next and looking at the environmental impacts and those changes and how they change that frequency. And if we get enough of accumulation of changes in their genetic structure, then we might actually end up seeing a result where a new species comes out of it. So populations are really what's changing here over generations, and we're looking now rather than at a overall species, looking at the macroscopic scale, we're zooming in and taking a look at how does that change happen for one particular characteristic. So if we're going to talk about evolution by natural selection, we've got to take a step back and sort of remember what you would have learned previously about genetics. And so there's some terms here that we need to make sure we understand and we have straight so that as we're moving forward with this conversation, we can utilize the appropriate vocabulary. So first and foremost is this idea of an allele. So when we look at a characteristic, say eye color, for example, then a particular allele is the different variations for that given characteristic. So brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes. All right. And when we designate that, think like your Punnett squares, then we'll use different letters, both uppercase and lowercase, to designate those different variations. So if I look at something like brown eyes and blue eyes, well, I might use a capital letter A to designate that brown eye allele, lowercase a for the blue eye allele. And what we're really saying is not only are there variations in the physical manifestation of that, but then there's variations in those organisms' DNA sequence that correspond to it. So that's where those terms genotype and phenotype come up. So genotype is the actual DNA code. So if I were to look at the sequence of nucleotides, the A's, T's, C's, and G's for somebody who has brown eyes, their sequence is going to look different than somebody who has DNA coding for blue eyes, right? And so we'll talk about transcription and translation and how DNA ends up coding to proteins, and that's where that's all going to end up connecting. But when we designate or we write out a shorthand for what those genotypes look like, you often end up seeing one of these three associations. So remember that you get DNA both from your mom and from your dad. So that's where those two letters come from. So one of these A's is going to correspond to the sequence of DNA your mom passed to you. The other one is the sequence of DNA that dad passed. All right, and so you can have three different variations for a traditional genetic trait. Your phenotype then is the physical manifestation of that coded DNA. So if I have two double A's, then that's going to mean that my eye color is brown. All right, and that's where the ideas of dominant versus recessive come. So dominant traits, I only need a single allele or a single DNA code to actually express that trait. Recessive means I'm going to need two of them. So if I am somebody who is homozygous dominant, means homo is the same, so I have two of the same letter, then I'm homozygous dominant, and in this case, I would be brown eyes. Or I can be homozygous recessive, and so I have two lowercase copies, and I have the blue eyes. Now, the only way to show that recessive trait is to have two copies of that lowercase a, okay, or two DNA sequences. So both mom and dad gave you that recessive trait. If you're heterozygous, now you've got one of each, right? Hetero means different. So you've got a capital A and a lowercase a. That capital A may have come from mom, lowercase may come from dad, but it doesn't matter because all you need to show that dominant trait is a single gene for that dominant characteristic. So one parent gave you the code for that dominant trait, and as a result, you're going to show that dominant characteristic when we look at your phenotype. So when I go back to my genotypes, right, it can be homozygous dominant, I can be heterozygous, or I can be homozygous recessive. The only way to show the dominant characteristic is to have one capital A. That's all I need. So both this guy here, my double A or my big A, little a, that's going to show that dominant characteristic. All right, because I have one capital. My lowercase is going to show the recessive one, but in order to show it, I have to have two lowercase, and hopefully that makes sense. So when we look at natural selection, we're looking at those allele frequencies, right? How often does the capital A show up? How often does the lowercase show up? We can zoom in and say how many of them are homozygous dominant versus homozygous recessive. But all that genetic variation changes as different individuals with those characteristics survive and reproduce or die off, and as a result, don't pass that set of genetics on as often. We can also talk about how that genetic variation can increase in a population by things like mutations. So random changes in the DNA sequence that now all of a sudden not only give me brown eyes versus blue eyes, but all of a sudden I now have green eyes too, right? There's a new variation in my population. Crossing over and mixing up genetic information, independent assortment, also mixing up genetic information as we go to make sex cells. So we'll talk about this process called meiosis, and that's how sexually reproducing organisms make eggs and sperm. And there are processes going on within that cell division process, that creation of those gametes, those sex cells, that also can increase the variation in my population. So sexual reproduction is a really big way to get variation into a population. And that also corresponds to that random mating, right? Who do I pick? Do I end up selecting mates because of they have certain traits? Well, that's not quite random mating. That's what we'll talk about as sexual selection or sexual choice. But random mating, where I'm just going to mate with whoever's around, or perhaps we're talking something like fish, where they just kind of spew their eggs and sperm out into the water, and whoever finds each other, right? So all of these can help to increase the genetic variation, the number of different characteristics for a particular trait that I have, right? So brown eyes versus blue eyes, and then adding something like green, or I don't know, maybe a species has purple eyes, so that kind of stuff. We're adding different variations by things like mutations and the creation of these sex cells and the way that they mate. So that genetic variation is really what we talk about in terms of a population's gene pool. Okay, how many different gene possibilities, how many different traits could exist in that population, and that's what we have to work with. Okay, that's the different pieces that we can put together and pick and choose from based on what's best for that organism and that population, that species, to survive in its given environment. So each allele exists at a certain rate, or what we talk about as an allele frequency. If I look at the general population for eye color, perhaps brown eyes makes up 75% of the population and blue eyes accounts for 25%. Those are allele frequencies. And then I can dig into, well, how many people have a capital A versus a lowercase a, and look at a frequency at that level as well. So we've got some choice, we've got some options in terms of the levels at which we study this. So when we look at evolution overall as a process, there really are pieces or individual processes within that overarching concept of evolution that allow evolution to happen. The mutations are there. We'll talk a little bit about those today. Natural selection and adaptation we'll get to. And then we can also, within this context of microevolution, talk about things like genetic drift and gene flow and sexual selection and how those end up changing and altering those allele frequencies from one generation to the next based on how organisms are able to reproduce and pass on that genetic information. So let's talk mutations, right? So genetic mutations are a way for populations to get new diversity introduced, because what I'm doing is changing the actual DNA structure. Something happens to those A's, T's, C's, and G's that causes them to change, and as a result, the phenotype changes, right? So something happens in the DNA structure, that's your genotype, that then causes a change in the phenotype, the physical expression of that information. We can also get added variety by sexual reproduction by just mixing up different characteristics. So that's putting your two capital A's together or putting a capital A with a lowercase. All right, and so do I end up homozygous dominant or heterozygous or homozygous recessive? And that's because of sexual reproduction. So there's a couple of pieces to understand when we talk about mutations. First and foremost, this is really the only way that we can get brand new variation into a population. But it's really not a common thing to happen. So there are a lot of structures and a lot of proofreading processes that happen when we go to make new DNA to make a new cell that sort of stop mutations from occurring. Now, they're not perfect, right? Mutations happen, they get through. The other thing here is that in order for that mutation to matter evolutionarily, I have to be able to pass that mutation on to my offspring. Now, most of the organisms that we talk about, us, a cat, a dog, a chicken, these guys are all sexually reproducing organisms. They're also multicellular organisms. So in order for a sexually reproducing multicellular organism to have a mutation that's going to matter from an evolutionary standpoint, that mutation has to occur in cells that will ultimately create those sex cells, those eggs and sperm. All right, this is why something like skin cancer, which is a result of a mutation that happens in your skin cells, all right, causes skin cancer, but you're not going to necessarily pass that skin cancer on to your offspring because it's occurring in skin cells, not your sex cells. So the only way that these mutations end up being functional from an evolutionary standpoint is if that mutation ends up in a sex cell. But once that happens once, so long as that offspring survives to make their own children, they will then forevermore pass that sex cell, or pass that mutation, onto their offspring, because once that single sex cell gets passed on to the next generation, that offspring's body is made from that single cell, which means now every cell in that offspring's body has that mutation. Okay, so when they go to make their sex cells, they will naturally have that mutation in their sex cells as well and continue to pass it on. And that's why things like breast cancer or any cancer that's known to have a family history, it's an inherited cancer, is because somewhere along the way, that mutation that's associated with that cancer happened in a sex cell. That offspring now was born with that mutation. It's now pervasive throughout their entire body. They go to make their sex cells, the mutation's already there, and they'll continue to pass it on. Okay. So mutations in general, regardless of where they happen, they're heritable changes that are changing the DNA code itself. So here, if I take a look, here's a normal gene, right? Okay, it happens to code for this cysteine amino acid, so building blocks for proteins, right? I get this particular mutation, and what happened is I changed a cysteine, all right, or a G, to an A. Now, rather than coding for a cysteine amino acid, I now have a tyrosine, and that then leads to changes in the way that protein is produced, which is what we physically see as something different. Okay, so long as that mutation happened in a sex cell, this will now continue to become something that natural selection can work on. So mutations are important because what they do allow evolution to do is increase the genetic diversity. So here's my gene pool, right? Okay, this is what my population has to pull from as they're making the next generation. Mutations allow me to increase the diversity that already exists. I get to add new traits. I get to add new variation for a particular characteristic. Now, those mutations, although they're changes in DNA, and if I can pass them on because they've happened in sex cells, evolution can work on it. So if I look at a mutation, I really have sort of three options as to what that mutation will ultimately do to the function of that organism who now has it. All right. So a mutation may be a favorable change. It may be an adaptation and actually improve a species' ability to exist in its environment, in which case, if I'm looking at allele frequencies from one generation to the next, if this mutation allows that species to survive and reproduce better than the current variation in the population, then we should expect this mutation to actually become more common. It should be selected for, in which case these guys should survive and reproduce more often, and over successive generations, this should become the common trait. That's one option, if that mutation helps them survive better than what's already currently existing in the population. Option number 2 is what most kids associate mutations with, and those are unfavorable changes, something that doesn't improve their ability to exist and in fact may actually be harmful. So if I look at our cute little turtles here, all right, you see all these normal colorations for turtles. The coloration is presumably there to help them blend in, camouflage, and I've got these poor little albinos guys here who have this mutation that now allows them to stick out better. These guys are now going to be subjected to stronger natural selection in the sense that nature's probably going to weed this out. All right, this isn't beneficial to them. They're more able to be seen by their predators, and so these guys are going to get eaten, get killed off, and even if they do maybe pass on the trait to 1 or 2 offspring, they're probably not leaving the number of offspring behind that the rest of these guys are, and so that trait should disappear relatively quickly. Okay, or at least the frequency should drop. There's also a third option. So rather than it being favorable and increasing the population, it's not unfavorable, and so it's not decreasing. I get situations where I have a change in the genetic information that doesn't help the species, but it doesn't harm it either. All right. And so it might be something as simple as being sort of this white versus cream rose. Well, they're kind of similar, maybe not identical. The sequence may not be identical, but it doesn't help them, it doesn't hurt them. All right, and so if that's the case, this frequency for this allele really is going to change at random because natural selection isn't going to work on something that isn't beneficial. It's also not going to work on something if it's not harmful. And so these traits can kind of bounce around. Maybe they'll disappear. Maybe they'll become more common. We kind of just don't know, other than just to kind of watch it and study it. So there's really no way to predict what will happen here.